Yamo. I'm Jeffrey Gomeroy Man, First Nations Engagement Lead with the One Basin and First Nations Premier Lead for the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holders Science Program Floater. Welcome to the last webinar for the year, and we have saved an important one to last. Public First Nations data is data nullius, examining the structural limits of ethical Indigenous data governance. And thank you for all being here today or watching the recording at a later time. We're here today in Naarm, Melbourne, part of the Kulin Nation. We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung clans on whose country we're on today. These lands were never ceded, and we feel so fortunate to be here on this country and acknowledge how the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people have cared for these lands for millennia. I'd also like to extend this to all nations of the Murray-Darling Basin and beyond. The lands have changed, but not our determination of our people and our advocates. I want to acknowledge all those who have come before, those here doing deadly work, and those will come up and keep things going into the future. And I also hope you'll all be a voice for country and care for it in any way you can. If you haven't done so already, please write in the chat what country you're on, and that'd be great. We're all here from the One Basin CRC, and with me today is Professor Troy Meston, ULEI, and Gamilaroi Mann, First Nations Program Lead, and Biri O'Day, a Gungaloo and Birigubba Woman, First Nations Program Manager. As with all cooperative research centres, our partners are at the heart of everything we do. They play a vital role in shaping our direction, informing our priorities, and ensuring that our work delivers meaningful outcome across the basin. Throughout genuine co-design, we draw on the insights of our end-user organisations to define real-world challenges that need to be solved. From there, we work alongside our commercialisation partners and knowledge agencies to turn these ideas into practical, scalable solutions. Just as importantly, we bring First Nations people and local communities to the same table, ensuring every voice is respected and contributes to decisions we make. The strength of the One Basin CRC lies in the diversity of those who work with us. Our partners represent a wide and dynamic mix of industries, communities, institutions, and knowledge systems, all united by a shared commitment to the future of the Murray-Darling Basin. The Murray-Darling Basin spans over 1 million square kilometres, making it one of the most largest and complex river systems in the world. To support the regions and communities that depend on this basin, One Basin CRC has strategically established 4 thriving hubs in Gundawindi, Griffith, Mildura and Loxton. These hubs are more than just workplaces. They are places where people come together to co-design water solutions for a rapidly changing climate. They bring community, industry and researchers into one room to share knowledge, test ideas, build practical pathways forward. Each hub is also a home base for emerging researchers, including PhD candidates and postdocs, who are helping shape the next generation of innovations across the basin. I'll now pass over to Troy, who will lead the discussion on applied learnings.
Thanks, Jeff. We're really excited to be here for the final webinar for the AWS seminar webinar program for the year. It's a really exciting project. We're happy to that we have the opportunity now to be able to share some of the learnings from this significant project. So what we call this is applied learning from a First Nations program, Indigenous Data Project. So key to this particular piece of work, before we actually get into discussing the phases of the research, the outcomes, and some key lessons and learnings for the sector, we begin first by acknowledging the role that our First Nations Applied Management Advisory Committee played here inside the CRC. So on the screen, there's a snapshot of our membership, and this is made up of a really eclectic, unique mix of expertise. So it spans elder leadership. It has a gender balance, deliberate gender balance, but it also has a continuum of intergenerational expertise, all the way down from elders through to senior researchers, through to early career researchers, to HDR candidates, and we have our student representatives who sit on this particular committee with us. The role of the committee in this particular project is that that helped co-design, helped stress test the emergent findings, and helped to shape the final artifacts that came from this particular project. And as we go through this presentation, there'll be a couple of snapshots of the input and the role that they played. So we begin first with some of the comments. So when we presented this research, or the opportunity to do this research, to our advisory committee, you can see displayed on the screen is some statements that capture the sentiment of the importance of this work from our advisory committee. So you can see that the top quote talks about the importance of finally getting around to doing this particular work, making sure that somebody's standing up for First Nations data and ensuring that we have control of this important resource as we move further into the digital age. We can see sentiments from the advisory committee saying that there's great hesitation in and around sort of the use, or the sort of the role that data plays in making key decisions of our First Nations communities. So our advisory committee was a very strong will and strong voice in saying that, the way that this data historically has been used has been used negatively against our people. And finally, we have an opportunity to be able to have a say in ensuring that data actually has some real world translational impact for our people and our communities. So that's the role that our advisory committee played, and they helped frame this research and gave us a real strong directionality as we move forward. So the project had a number of phases. We began first with a desktop review of engaging the key literature that's been conducted across the space. Got to the point where we developed a set of emergent principles. We took that to our advisory committee, and together with our advisory committee, we settled on a set of 27 principles, which we'll unpack as we go through this presentation. And now we get to the point where we begin the translation of this particular research, and hopefully it gets sort of a sector-wide impact. All right, to begin with. What we conducted was what we called the hybrid rapid review. So we had a really short turnaround in the time that we had available to us to be able to complete this research. So what we do is a First Nations research program. We operate, and you can see the figure in the middle of the screen here. We operate in what's called the cultural interface, or as post-colonial researcher Homi Bhabha would call the third space of enunciation. So we operate with a foot in each world, drawing heavily upon our lived experiences as First Nations researchers, applying First Nations research principles, but we also operate within a really steep power symmetry where most research methodologies and university structures heavily bias Western methods of applied research. So for us, as First Nations researchers within the space, what we have to do is we have to straddle between these two worlds, and we have to draw the best of both worlds, if you will, in a synergized methodological framework to be able to progress and advance First Nations research that's beneficial and has real world impact for our people in our communities. So that's a bit of a framing lens that will set up the rest of this particular presentation. So we frame this section called Interrogating the Literature. So we begin by talking a little bit about our framing methodology, our lens. But the first the first pillar, the first challenge that we always face as First Nations peoples, and particularly First Nations researchers in the space, is dealing with the phenomenon of settler colonialism. And quite often what we find is when we engage across the sector, but particularly across research contexts, is that quite often there's a misnomer about colonization being past tense. And quite often, particularly early on, you'd hear sentiments reflected back to us like, colonization was something that happened in the past. Isn't it time for First Nations people to actually get over it and get on with the business of, controlling your lives. However, what most people don't understand is that we're dealing with a really specific form of colonization. So unlike other forms of colonization, and particularly across, the third world, so particular areas across Africa as well as across Asia, post 1960s, they went through a process of decolonization where colonial or imperial governments actually exited the lands that they occupied in those particular continental regions, and they transitioned control back to First Nations people in Australia and other areas like the US, Canada and New Zealand. What we have a really different phenomenon where the ruling powers don't actually leave our countries. So we deal with a continuing set of structural inequalities and structural oppression that we have to deal with as First Nations people. So key work that comes from the post-colonial or settler colonial sort of research space is work that comes from the late Patrick Wolfe, who coined this term that settler colonialism is not a structure, but it's an event. It's a structure, not an event. So you can see displayed on the screen here, you can see the cascading impact of structural inequality as it affects our people, and how it shapes the internal and external conditions of a geographical continental space. So that's the first challenge, first complexity that we have to deal with. How do we actually negotiate data, or the phenomenon of actually using data for benefit for our people? And the first hurdle that we have to encounter is settler colonialism. Building from there, we have three phases of epistemic violence that relate to data management. So taking a historical lens, continuing the historical focus, we can see in the top left-hand corner of the screen, we can see the phenomena or the legal injunction of terra nullius that was invoked to justify the annexation of the territorial lands of Australia for the Crown. We can see in the middle of the screen, we have a phenomenon or a term that was sort of recently emerged that relates strongly to the original theft of land of First Nations people that relate back to terra nullius. But this time it's related specifically to the water space, and that's the coining of the term aqua nullius. So as a result of the completion of our particular research project, our team coined the term data nullius to again demonstrate and reflect that there's this First Nations asset, natural asset that seems to be available for free, available free for exploitation. So data nullius, by us using that term to actually coin the way that First Nations data is available and open for people to use without really consent and any sort of oversight or governance from our people, we can see that there's really strong connections back to the theft of land and the actual theft and annexation, continuing annexation of First Nations water. So that's a framing lens. Then we can continue on with the historical theme as well. On the screen, what you have is like three really common First Nations clearinghouses of data. So Productivity Commission related to the Closing the Gap metrics. We have the ABS and their First Nation specific data houses, data storage. Then we have the AIHW and their particular subset of data related to First Nations people. All of this is freely available. It's online. You can free to access. However, what we say again, and tying into this connotation or this term of data nullius, so all this data is available and it's out there, and people can use this and access free without consultation or oversight from First Nations people. But it has a really long, strong, enduring legacy in the way that First Nations people have been managed as a result of colonization and continuing settler colonization in this country. Data repositories, exclusion from census counts have all been used at different times to surveil First Nations people and make considerable decisions or really influential decisions related to our people, whether we counted in the population, or if we had access to housing, or if we were included in health and education policies, or if we had our children removed from us. So in different ways, at different times across the shared history of white and black Australia, data has been used as a really negative tool, and a tool that's been used to disempower First Nations people. And unfortunately, this data that's openly available often frames or structurally frames our people as being a problem, or there's problems that need to be solved, and the only way to be able to fix that is by government intervention, as opposed to deferring to First Nations leadership and self-determination. All right, so we're starting to move now into how do we actually control the data? How do we actually empower First Nations people to take ownership of these data storage repositories? And how do we work with First Nations people to ensure that the way that we manage data and we house data is used for community benefit? Well, we had at the turn of the century, the turn of the 21st century, we had a real shift inside universities and knowledge production in the way that they handled, or the way that they conducted First Nations research. So prior to the 1990s, what we had is we had over proliferation of non-Indigenous people who would come into our communities and would research our people and would make decisions or write papers or write up research reports about our people, and then they'd leave the communities and there'd be no reciprocal benefit actually going back to our people in our communities. So initiating a shift in the way that research was conducted with our people was two really significant events. And one was the decolonization of research and research practice. And you can see that represented on the left-hand side of your screen through a Maori researcher by the name of distinguished Professor Linda Tuahi Smith. And her book, Decolonizing Methods, the Methodologies, was one of those seminal landmark pieces of work that really shifted the way that not just research occurred here in this country, but right around First Nations context, right around the world globally. So you can see in the middle of the screen, to emerge from works like Linda Smith's, we had a number of decolonizing Indigenous frameworks that came into the research space, or the research paradigm, to be able to shift the way that research was done. So research really moved away from focusing an external lens on First Nations communities to then empowering First Nations communities to actually lead that research. And eventually we had First Nations researchers being represented at the highest levels inside universities. So then we had the opportunity to be able to lead research agendas. We had the opportunity to be able to create our own methodologies. And on the right-hand side of the screen, at the same time as the research space was undergoing a shift towards decolonization, we had the rise of what's referred to in the literature as the Indigenous Renaissance. And that's the return of Indigenous knowledges coming to the research space. We say return because what happened was, up until really the 1960s, First Nations people were excluded primarily from universities. And after the 1960s, we had slowly our people started to filter into the university sector. And once we made it through the undergraduate levels and we started to get to the higher levels, to the doctorate and the postdoctoral levels, we found is that in the early days, our people, there was no sort of validation or justification or even window or latitude to be able to use our own knowledge systems inside the research that those early pioneers were engaged in. And so what we found was, what the literature reports, is that those pioneers in the First Nations research space, encountered all these sorts of complexities and trouble trying to engage the continuing issues that are created by settler colonization in and around, access to health and education and incarceration and all sorts of impacts that come from continuing colonization in our countries. Engaging these complexities using primarily Western research tools and methodologies. And what we found was that there was an incompatibility in the way that these methods and these tools were able to really engage in interrogating and targeting those particular challenges. So post at the beginning of the 21st century, we see an influx of indigenous knowledges coming from all around the world, floating into the way that First Nations were able to do research. So the shift towards decolonization and the influx of indigenous knowledges provide a wonderful foundation for us to be able to make some really critical decisions in the way that First Nations data management, and data sovereignty will occur moving forward. So the link between the decolonial turn and the influx of indigenous knowledges, we can see now we're getting further into the digital age, progressing further into the 21st century. We see that there's now a proliferation of research emerging from right around the world, led by First Nations researchers and First Nations data sovereignty collectives that are looking at how do we actually manage data. How do we respectfully handle data? How do we empower First Nations communities to be able to make critical decisions in and around that data that actually benefits nations? So how do we use data to be able for nation building, so to speak? So as part of our research, what we did is we did a thorough stock take of these particular frameworks from right around the country, from right around the world. So you can see key research or data sovereignty frameworks that come from Australia, but also Canada, from the US, and from Aotearoa and New Zealand. So we use those foundations to be able to take a bearing on how we actually develop a set of principles that will empower the water sector, but beyond, in the way that the water sector and other sort of leading national, Commonwealth, state, federal government organizations then make decisions in and around First Nations data. So key learnings that we get from the literature in this early phase is we see that certain data that is specific to First Nations communities must have restricted access or particular nuanced specific licensing agreements in place. There'll be particular cultural knowledge, particularly historical knowledge, gender specific knowledge, or knowledge related to sacred sites across country, across water country and water landscapes that will need to be protected moving forward. We also found that data, as we said before, must serve the aspirations of First Nations communities. Data has to become a tool to support nation building, and that local communities, while we see that there's this proliferation of work that's expanding right around the world, and we see that First Nations research scholars are leading some really phenomenal, impactful work across the world, we're yet to see that really materialize or translate down to the grassroots local community levels, and we're yet to see local communities being adequately empowered to be able to take carriage of data, but also to be able to, to be upskilled via capacity building, to be able to engage with the data in the digital formats. All right. First step to assembling our principles. So that was a bit of a summation of the literature and some of the impactful work that guided us, allowed us to be able to start to develop a set of guiding principles that will be able to inform the water sector moving forward. So what we did was we drew from NIA's framework for Indigenous Data Governance, and we also drew from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Independence, Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as the two guiding frameworks that allowed us to draw what we called foundational primary sets of data governance principles. So some of you might be familiar with these terms, however, a lot of you might not be. And on the next couple of slides, we'll break down These key principles break them down and give you a bit of a framing definition to allow you to be able to engage with the rest of the slides moving forward. So we have FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, Indigenous cultural intellectual property, ICIP, Indigenous data sovereignty, partnerships with First Nations people, building of First Nations digital related capabilities, transparency pertaining to data assets, and building of inclusive data systems. So we use those as the guiding principles that allowed us to be able to engage with a sector-wide analysis. So we'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, but it's to allow you to engage with some of these definitions. So data sovereignty implies the right of Indigenous people to exercise ownership over data. ICIP talks about recognizing the rights of Indigenous people to have their cultural heritage knowledges and cultural expression protected. So ensuring that nations have the right to that, to be able to make their own decisions related to that. Free, prior, informed consent, you'll see that appearing fairly commonly now if you're working in and around the First Nations space, talking about that you must obtain First Nations consent to the collection of use of data moving forward. Partnerships with First Nations people means that you're working with local and relevant First Nations people involved in and around the data capture, and that they must have continued partnership across the entire data lifecycle and ecosystem. First Nations digital building, digital related capabilities. As I said before, there's a real clear digital divide in our country, and the further that you move away from the urban built-up areas, the more the complexity scales. So at the moment, First Nations community, particularly at the local level, don't have the digital capacity to be able to take carriage of data in a digital format. So we need to ensure that we're actually in parallel while providing oversight and governance. We have to be actually building capacity in local First Nations communities. So giving them access to the data, to the IT software and hardware, and then also building human resource capacity in and around making sure that that data is managed, handled, and licensed appropriately. Transparency pertaining to data assets is pretty common, pretty easy to understand, and building of inclusive data systems. So we're talking about facilitating the infrastructure surrounding and the enhancement of digital literacy, ensuring that equitable access for First Nations communities and people to digital infrastructure, seeding digital-centric opportunities, and ensuring that related to Indigenous data for relevant First Nations communities. So they're the founding principles, key primary guiding principles that we used. Then what we did was we conducted a sector-wide analysis. So we looked at 30 key sectors across the Australian landscape. And you can see here on the screen that we have the breakdown of our entities examined. You can see it's a range from government entities to universities, private companies, and research institutes. What we found in this preliminary analysis, we found that out of all the sort of the indicators, the one that featured most highly across the 30 entities was the ability to be able to make partnerships with First Nations people. However, the other key metrics, we can see that there's still quite a bit of work to do across the sector. So ICIP, FPIC, Indigenous data sovereignty was only represented in up to 30% of the policies that we examined from those key sector entities. You can see that there's still quite a lot of work to do across the sector. So what we did then was we actually narrowed our focus down to 10 entities that we found were actually displaying best practice in relation to those first 7 primary indicators. So we did a deep dive on these 10 sector-leading entities, and to emerge from our deep dive, we garnered an additional 20 indicators, or Indigenous data governance indicators, and you can see those represented on the screen. We'll engage with these fairly heavily across the remainder of the slides, so I'll continue to move on. We found that on the left-hand side of your screen, we found that The ones displayed in purple, we found that they were shared. They were shared right across the 10 entities that we did the deep dive on, and then the green were really unique and sometimes only featured in one or two of the entities that we examined. The end of it, we had we assembled an array of 27, what we call 27 Indigenous Data Governance principles. So you can see the green, the unique indicators, the purple, the shared ones, and then we had our primary indicators down below. So then what we did was, once we collated and assembled these particular indicators or these metrics, we then applied these principles to a number of data sets. And what we'll do is we'll give you a bit of an insight into how you can actually apply these principles to public data. Hand over to Birin.
Thanks, Troy. So just as a bit of a framing, and this goes back to what Troy was talking about before, when you look at an Indigenous worldview versus a Western worldview, a really simple example of that is looking at seasons. So we're here in Melbourne at the moment, and the local Wurundjeri people they've got 7 seasons, which is in contrast to when you think of the Western observation of 4 seasons, which ironically started by English people in the Northern Hemisphere, so not even in the same location that we reside. So Western views reduce country-based understanding of, nature, natural changes in the environment, changes with the animals, and things like that. So this just shows that there's that difference between framing right from the start. Here we've drawn an example, and it's an old example, but it's just to show that when data is collected, how it really doesn't serve Indigenous purposes. So the first one, top left-hand side, looking at population. So this data reorientates country within a hierarchy that First Nations people wouldn't necessarily attribute to location. So, major cities, regional, remote, very remote. It breaks it down into, removes country, removes people, removes relationality from the understanding of locations. Top right-hand side, talking about families, again, categorized as whether you're a couple with children, a couple without children, 1 parent, 2 parent. It removes First Nations relationships, kinship systems, ethics of caring, again, relationality, connection, all of those things are removed when you start looking at large data sets. And then the bottom one, when you're looking at population characteristics, it's homogenizing First Nations people into Indigenous, non-Indigenous. It removes nations, it removes relationality, it removes connection. And this is that sort of opportunity again for us to be put into deficit categories that homogenize us into categorizations that we wouldn't necessarily identify with or choose to use to describe ourselves. So now, looking back at those 27 Indigenous data governance principles that we had developed before, we took them as a whole set to create a diagnostic tool. I just want to be really clear here that this diagnostic tool, the example that we're giving, was developed for a specific project, and how it would translate for each different project is, it's a living thing. It's potentially different for every project that comes along. So we took these 27 principles and then we created a diagnostic tool with, we started to think initially about different phases of data. At the beginning, you're thinking of data collection, then there's the sort of middle phase of a project, or maybe it's the post-data collection phase. And then at the end, you've got the public data set. And we then thought about it as a traffic light system. So we looked at, looking at those sorts of things, I guess, and using that traffic light system, when you're thinking about green, it's a bit safer, it's a bit more it's easier to go with orange. You need to be a bit cautious. By the time you get to the red, you're being very cautious. So we started to ask questions because it was a public data set we were using. We asked ourselves, how self-determined was the data? Was there any cultural authority in its collection? What was it collected for? How could we disaggregate the data, or is it purely high level, hierarchical, homogenized data? Who has access to the data? We also looked at why was this publicly available data set being examined? Was it for the purpose of a First Nations directed project? Was it non-Indigenous people that were just trying to, again, make some assumptions about First Nations people without their contribution, their insights, and that sort of thing? So there were a lot of questions that we went through in the beginning to work out where and which Indigenous data governance principles could be applied. So then we took, as you can see on the left, this is the 27 principles. We then interrogated every single principle against our set of questions. So when you think about Indigenous data sovereignty, that has to come at the bottom. It can't come by the time you have a public data set. There's no opportunity for Indigenous data sovereignty to be taking place. So we put that, down the bottom. We did this for all 27. And this, I just want to say this configuration relates specifically to the project we did. A different project, the configuration might end up different. But this was the configuration of asking the question related to our project and attributing the 27 principles. So if we look at the red tier, which is at the top, so it's a public data set that we were examining, we found that only 4 of the 27 principles could be applied, but it has to be noted they could only partially be applied at this stage. So for example, we've pulled up the first one here, partnerships with First Nations people. Looking back at our definition, there are parts of this definition that can't be fully enacted at this point. They're not wholly collaborated with because we don't know at a public data level, was there collaboration from the beginning? Was it across the data life cycle? Has it been across the entire ecosystem of this? So, and again, importantly, written agreements, protocols, memorandums of understanding must be entered into. The assumption's made that those things have not been entered into at the beginning of the data collection, but to actually use a public data set now, you need to go back to the community or the people the data set relates to, and you need to, I guess, almost retrofit those sorts of things to make sure that it's happening so that the use of this public data is still is done as ethically as possible. At the orange level here, so these were the principles that we found that could be applied when you're talking about a mid-project. Maybe it's post-data collection. Maybe you're getting ready, you've done some data collection, you haven't finished it. These were the 6 principles that we felt could be attributed to the project we were looking at. But also, when you attribute these ones, you also then needed to attribute the 4 above it as well. So it wasn't just these 6, it's these 6 plus the 4 from the red tier as well. So the more of the 27 principles that you can fit into any project, the better chance that it's ethically appropriate, that it's recognizing First Nations right to data sovereignty. So at the green tier, obviously when we laid out the 27 principles across our 3 stages, we used each principle once, but ideally at the beginning stage, all 27 principles can and should be integrated into the design and governance of data. So it's not a matter of just picking and choosing at the start of a project. It's actually looking, really interrogating all of these principles and seeing how they can be, ethically and equitably attributed to any project right from the beginning. And it's those discussions and that inclusion right from the start. Looking at why projects are created, who's leading them, who's instigating them, because it really should be nation-led. So this is really broad, looking at sort of organizational level considerations when you are using First Nations data or doing, data collection, but looking for broad, holistic definitions of Indigenous data. So what non-Indigenous people may just consider very simple data things, First Nations people consider a lot more. Country is full of data. It's, stories are full of data, songlines are full of data, relationships are full of data. There are a lot of places that there's Indigenous data. So there needs to be a very holistic definition of Indigenous data. There must be Indigenous data sovereignty, and Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights must be adhered to. So self-determination and sovereignty over the entire data life cycle and governance. Accountability oversight measures. What does it look like to actually hand control of that data over? And the Troy talked before about the First Nations, free, prior and informed consent. It's about agency. It's about that capacity building. First Nations people mightn't know, technically how to store data, but they know ethically how it should be stored, and those things can't be overlooked. And data must be contextualized, disaggregated and culturally responsive.
Right. Thanks, Troy and Biri, for those big, powerful ideas that you shared. So let's dive into some Q&A. And if you haven't put any questions in, now's the time to put it into the Q&A section, because we're keen to hear what your thoughts are and for you to have a voice in this. We may start with just a couple of questions that came through prior to today. A lot of data collected as part of a previous water program. However, we're not able to use any. Hang on a sec. Water program. However, we're not able to use any of a renewed Aboriginal water program. IP rights being the reason given. How do we ensure data?
You want to go first?
So you can go.
It's a good question, and it was good to see that as part of the registration process, people already had an interest and were sending through some questions. So we thank the person who shared this particular question with us. So the way that we'd answer this is that, as Biri just mentioned, that Indigenous data sovereignty is about relationships with First Nations people. So the key thing to do here is that firstly, who developed the Aboriginal water program, or what was its intent, and what was its purpose, and what benefit does it serve for Aboriginal people moving forward? That's key questions to be able to frame the use of data in a project moving forward. But then, if there's a number of historical layers of data that still remain, that there's opportunity to be able to reuse or engage with, then that would need to be done in partnership with the nations, the communities, the peoples whose that water data actually belongs to and relates to. So partnerships are key here, and collaboration is key in making sure that there's reciprocal mutual benefit going both ways. So there's benefit to the program for using First Nations data, but there's also got to be benefit going back to communities and nations for the sharing of that particular data.
Another one was detailed examples of how to store ICIP privately on an organisation's database or cloud system.
I think primarily before you even consider that, the question is, where does the community or the nation want that held? Do they want it on your database? Do they want it in your cloud system? The storage, the use, the collection of data is something that really has to happen in consultation with communities. They may not want it stored that way. They may have a preference for it to be stored another way.
And then if the community did agree and there was interest for the data to be held by an external organization, well, then that would need to be managed internally. So what we've written about is we've written that across the entire data ecosystem, there needs to be First Nations leadership and oversight. So you need to have First Nations leaders as data stewards. So people who are appointed to be able to be to take carriage and handle a safe, ethical handling of that data. Would advise also to be able to establish an internal institutional advisory committee or advisory panel that meets regularly to be able to discuss the way that the organization handles and manages data moving forward. And then we've seen some really innovative work while we've been doing this particular research from First Nations technical experts coming up with really innovative, culturally appropriate and specific ways for housing and handling data. So using really innovative gaming online platforms and creating digital twins of natural country waterscapes, landscapes, and attributing specific data to specific relational spots in that digital twin. So that's a really complicated and layered way to be able to address the handling and the storage of that data privately inside an organization.
And how would this apply to heritage places, like men's and women's areas?
Again, in consultation with them. So Troy touched on it earlier about the fact that there's, there can be some restricted data, there can be restricted access. And it's not just between First Nations people and non-Indigenous people. Even within nations, there's restrictions on, access to data and knowledge and things like that. So not all knowledge is for all people.
Cool. Is there potential for this tool to be developed for broader use, or is it too prescriptive?
I think there's absolute opportunity for that, and I mean it's being developed as a living tool that is continually evolving and adapting to the requirements of the various situations that arise.
And the key thing is that any tool is only as good as its user. And what we recommend and what we strongly urge is that this needs to be led by First Nations people, First Nations researchers, First Nations communities. So the tool is malleable and it's adaptive, and it can be applied in different contexts. But First Nations people need to drive the way that's used, and the decisions and the questions that are asked in and around the manipulation and the adaptation of that particular tool moving forward. So that's the key thing. Nothing with us without us. Nothing for us without us.
Yeah, too deadly. What would you recommend as a next step for people working in the research space in water and other industries should take to follow your principles and develop a specific tool?
Take the lesson from looking at data capture as an entire like data ecosystem. So at the planning preparation stage, you should already be planning for Indigenous data sovereignty. So from the earliest moments of conceptualization and research design, you should already have in place measures and approaches and reciprocal obligations that are inbuilt into the way that you conduct research, the way that you capture data, the way that you use data, the decisions that you make with your data should all be done at the various earliest moments of the way that you conduct research.
I was going to say, I'd go back one step before that and is actually familiarize yourself with these terms, what they mean, and do some reading, educate yourself a bit about what the various kind of Indigenous data governance principles out there are, so that you're well informed. I think when you start to look at these principles, it raises questions in your own mind that I think will lead you down, making sure that your research and your projects are ethical.
Here's a really good question from Peter Hayes. Where and how can these principles be considered or incorporated into usual ethics approval systems and processes?
Well, already, thanks, Peter, for the question. Already as part of standard ethics HREC processes, they have to have data usage and management plans in place. So increasingly, I think that it'll become standard practice for HRECs to ask for an Indigenous data management plan, and we see these guiding principles being foundational to developing ethical and reciprocal data management processes.
Yeah, again, it's becoming familiar with what the various principles mean and how you can meaningfully enact them with working in partnership with First Nations people, communities, researchers, academics, to make sure that they are upheld appropriately, not tokenistic.
What support is there for each nation to lead this involvement and to give these approvals? Are they being adequately resourced as part of the project or ongoing engagement?
No. So as we said before, so while there's a proliferation of work that's being conducted internationally, we're yet to see meaningful translation down to the local community grassroots levels, and even less empowerment and resourcing of engagement and leadership at the grassroots level. So we implore everyone who's on this call here that you become leaders within your own rights, within your own spaces, across your own spheres of influence, and that you be champions for First Nations data, and ensuring that if there's opportunity to be seated, to be able to empower local communities to be able to take carriage and ownership and build capacity in relation to First Nations data, then we should all own that responsibility and share the load.
Great. Running out of time here a little bit, so I'll go to this one. Does data sovereignty apply to truth telling? Can stories be shared about massacres, Black resistance, and early colonial history?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's all part of our shared narrative. And again, it's all about partnerships and collaboration and benefit going both ways. So that's really painful and complex terrain to cross. But unfortunately, in the road to us becoming a unified country, it's terrain that must be crossed and encountered. But we have to do it together. It has to be in collaboration, and it's another opportunity to be able to build relationships moving forward.
Yeah, I'll probably finish with this last one. I'll just summarize it. But how can we confront the increasing use of AI by government and private organisations? And it goes on further around protecting cultural knowledge in the current system.
So AI is really complex and rapidly evolving as well. And we've just written a piece actually upon the mental models or the algorithms that are used inside those AI frameworks, and they're not based upon our First Nations knowledge systems or relational ways of being and doing. So we find that AI is really complex and really challenging, and particularly even more so in its application to inclusion and properly representing the interests and the diversity of First Nations people. We find that those algorithms are built and trained by big corporations, and that there's clear power asymmetries, and most of the people who are outside the dominant categorizations seem to be left out, or seem to be negatively impacted by these particular systems. So it's an emerging threat, continuing threat, and there's certainly a lot of work to be done to try and shift benefit over from those AI systems.
But also the large language models were trained on work that was not produced by First Nations people with their input and authority a lot of the time. So trained on a very non-Indigenous view of the world.
And narrow, yeah. Very narrow.
Cheers. To Deadly, my brother and sister, thank you. It's not easy being peppered with questions, but we've done a really great job there. And so that sort of ends the Q&A session. And what I'll do now is I'll hand it over to James to yarn up about next steps. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. My name's James. I'm the Communications Manager from One Basin CRC. First of all, I just want to thank Jeff, Troy, and Birry for such a insightful and thought-provoking presentation. If there's anything in this presentation that you want to revisit, in the coming days, you will get a link to the recording of the video, so that will be coming up soon if you want to revisit anything. And we've actually got, I just double-checked, we have, I think, 18 webinars, One Basin webinars that are have been conducted over the last couple of years by different parts of our research teams and partners that you can revisit on our AWS One Basin YouTube link. So please take a look at that. There is 18 hours worth of content to engage with and view. This is our last webinar for 2025, but we will be going again in 2026. We'll have a little bit of a break in January like everyone, but keep an eye out from February. I think February 11th is looking like the first 2026 webinar. Soon to be announced, so not 100% locked in, but we have webinars in the works on principles of integrated waterway and catchment management, incentivizing and financing climate change adaptation, water banking, and lots of other really fascinating topics. So they will be announced in the new year. So please keep an eye out for that. If it is your kind of thing, you will get a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So keep an eye on your email for that in the next 2 business days. And if you wouldn't mind, please do scan the QR code there to complete a short 1-minute survey, which will help us to make sure we're producing the best webinars we can. I think that's all from me, but yeah, thanks so much for all of your time and have a great summer. Thanks.